just heard here was recorded right here at my studio. 5 musicians in a room playing together with no overdubs, no edits, just one real performance captured exactly as it happened. The setup was anything but typical. We had handpan, sitar, tablas, upright bass and some percussion. In this video I'm going to walk you through the recording process and the whole mixing process to let it sound full and exciting but also natural. Okay, let's first talk about the recording session. The first thing we had a look at was how do we position the musicians. For me, I wanted the musicians to be able to see each other, to basically communicate with eye contact, and we didn't use any headphones for the recording. I wanted them to hear themselves naturally in the room and just have the possibility to react dynamically to the play of the other musicians. Then to minimize bleed from instruments into other microphones, I wanted to have them sitting as far apart as my room would allow for. I chose to just use close microphones. Usually I like to record room microphones, but the problem would be that the way I would pan the instruments later would never really match what my stereo room microphone would pick up. So I decided to not use any room microphone, but only direct microphones. And since we had a little bit of bleed from one instrument into other microphones, we still had like a pretty roomy sensation. What I used was a large diaphragm condenser on the tabla. I have already recorded this tabla player before and had good experience with that microphone in that position for his instrument. So I went with that again. For the handpan, I used the cardioid small diaphragm condenser from Reverbs and just place it above the instrument, and that was plenty to pick up the whole instrument. For the sitar, I also used the small diaphragm Reverbs condenser pointing right at the body of the instrument. For the percussion, 2 small diaphragm condensers as well, placed in an AB pattern. And for the upright bass, I used the dynamic microphone to pick up the natural sound of the instrument, and we also recorded the DI output of the bass for the low end. I made sure to leave tons of headroom during the recording so that I had room for the unexpected, because I had no idea what the musicians were going to play, and I definitely didn't want to clip any signal on the way into the computer. If we didn't have shot the video at the same time, I maybe have used some mobile absorbers to isolate the musicians a little bit more, but since the image was important as well, we didn't use any separation at all. And as it turned out, the little bit of bleed that I got recording this way was actually pretty fine. So yeah, it was a pretty minimalistic setup, which also makes the mixing a breeze because you don't have a bazillion tracks to work with. And now we're going to see how I mixed it. Okay, now I'm going to walk you through all the tracks in my mixing session and show you why and what I did. So let's start with the bass. Here we heard the 2 bass signals, the microphone and the DI mixed together. As you can hear, we still have some bleed. I could hear the sitar and the other instruments on the bass as well, but this little bit of bleed is pretty okay in such a setup because it just gives you some sense of depth and room. Since we don't have a room microphone, this really helps glue all the instruments together. So now let's see, what did we do to the 2 individual tracks? Let's listen to the microphone alone first. I have a very slight roll off in the bass and in the highs. In the lows, because I use the low end from the DI track that is a little bit more consistent and I don't need the low end from both signals, so I cut off a little bit from the microphone signal. Then I use this Lindell channel strip for the compression only. It doesn't do a lot, it's just like catching 1 or 2 dBs at a very moderate ratio, just to compact the bass a tiny little bit and even out the performance a tiny little bit. Then we have a limiter catching some peaks and giving us some volume. Now the bass DI track has a severe high cut because I only wanted to use the low end from the DI signal. We already have all the wooden tone from the microphone, so I don't need all that stuff up there from the DI. Then again, as on the microphone signal, I use this Lindell channel strip just to use the compression from it, also shaving off like, yeah, a dB or 2, 3, as you can see here. And also a little limiter to gain some volume. On the DI, it's not really limiting at all. It's really just used as a gain plugin. So now the microphone alone, and then I'm going to put in the DI signal so that you can hear how the low end is filling up. When combining multiple microphones or multiple signals, like in this case, to record one instrument, it's always good to check for phase relationship between the two. So I made sure that they would not cancel out each other, but work well into the same direction if you want, and give us a full nice sound. Nothing more for the bass. When you are recording upright bass, the most important thing is the musician and the room. And if those two are nice, then it's hard to really mess up an upright bass recording. But if the musician is playing inconsistently or the instrument has a bad tone, and if your room is not treated, then you're up for trouble and you get a lot of resonance and you don't get a full body of the instrument. So whenever you're recording upright bass, really make sure that you chose the right musician and record in a decent room, and then it's pretty easy. Now let's have a look at the tabla. Let's listen to it in context and then in solo for a second. The first treatment I have on the tabla is an EQ to mainly focus on the low end. The tabla is small in size but can produce quite a nice low end, and I wanted this to be featured when the tabla is playing more solo and be a little bit more gentle when it's playing with the bass and all the other instruments. The tabla is not an instrument that is usually used with upright bass, so we have a little bit of a fight between the upright bass and the tabla here, so I wanted to make sure that both work well together. So during the song, I had the bass boosted a tiny little bit just to make it sound a little bit fuller. But now, as you can see, as I move into this solo part, for example, we have a much bigger boost on the low end. And I automated this throughout different sections of the song just to, shape the tabla in a way that it would shine in the right spaces and be a little bit more gentle in other spaces. Let me show you what it sounds with and without the EQ. The next plugin we use here is Parallel Particles by Waves, and it's a kind of multi-band parallel compression thing. It really lets instruments pop out if you add a little bit of parallel compression. And I like the feature of being able to zoom in on different frequency ranges with the parallel compression and not just like full range parallel compression. Let's listen to this. You can hear when I bypass the plugin, it's getting smaller and gets lost a little bit in the mix. It's really helping to bring the tabla a little bit further forward and give it some nice snap. Now let's have a look at the percussion. We recorded the whole set with 2 microphones, and Pedro, the percussion player, played some congas, he had 1 or 2 cymbals, and he also played some shakers. Let's have a look at the conga first. EQ-wise, there's not a lot going on. There will be some automation on the congas and also on other tracks, but I'll come to the whole automation thing a little bit later towards the end of the video. But now here we only have a basic low cut, just, to clean up the lows a little bit. And then we have a good boost of high mids and highs to make the conga pop a little bit more. And finally, we have a limiter to catch some peaks and get us some safe loudness. So there's not a lot of treatment on those congas. And it's again the same thing. If the musician really has a well-tuned instrument and plays nicely in a good room, then mixing becomes really easy. Here we have a part where only the cymbals are playing. And as we can see here, I made some clip gain adjustments. I wanted this part to be a little bit more quiet so that the cymbals don't pop out too much. And sometimes I prefer using clip gain instead of doing a volume automation curve, because sometimes I am not at the automation stage yet. I keep this up for a later stage in the mix because I start with a static mix most of the time and add automation a little bit later. But in this case, I thought it's a good idea to have those cymbals a little bit softer, so I just made a clip gain adjustment. And on top of the pure workflow order of things, using clip gain lets you see immediately that you did something to the volume instead of having to switch back and forth from volume automation curve to waveform overview to see if or what you did. Now, another thing I did to this percussion setup is I panned it to the right, not completely, but like, let's say 3/4 to the right. And I put the tabla on the other side, because one thing also to get a nice balanced mix is to have a look at a nice even stereo spread. So I have some percussion like the conga on the right, I have the tabla on the left, I have the bass in the center, I have the handpan, which is kind of the lead instrument, almost in the center, and the sitar also a little bit slightly panned out so that we have like a nice stereo image. Now, before we continue with the sitar, if you like this kind of videos with mix deconstructions and actual real-life mixing tips, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next video. Okay, let's have a look at the sitar. Now, you may have noticed that when we listen to the complete song, the sitar appears to be a little bit louder than if I solo it. That's because we have some bleed from different instruments into other microphones. In this case, we have some sitar also in the percussion microphones. I think maybe even in the, let's see, in the tabla microphone. Yeah, in the handpan microphone. Quite a bit even. So when mixing something that has been recorded live together in one room, you should not go in and solo too much onto instruments because they have to play nicely all together. So when you're balancing your stuff, listen to everything at once and balance within the complete mix, because if you're just going to work on an individual track, it may sound fine on its own, but maybe not work well in the context. So what did we do to the sitar? We have an EQ. Slightly cleaning up the very lows, just in case there would be some rumble, and boosted the fundamental a little bit. There's nothing more going on EQ-wise. Again, a limiter just to gain a little bit of volume. Catching occasional peaks. Okay, and finally we have, let's say, the main instrument, the handpan. Let's listen to that. It It's a very rich sounding instrument, and I don't know if it has ever been designed to play in a full like ensemble with percussion and everything. It seems to me that it's more like a solo instrument, which makes it a little bit challenging to integrate into more different instruments because it's really full range. It has a ton of sustain, it has a ton of sound. So we have to see if we can control it a little bit so that it's not eating up all the space and leaves nothing left for the others. Let's see what we did. The first thing I added was an instance of soothe, compressing or controlling, or let's say calming down the fundamental range of the handpan, because you have a lot of sustain and some ringing, and I just wanted to tame that a tiny little bit. That's not a dramatic change, but it's calming down the low end a little bit. Next, we have an EQ that is removing some of the percussion stuff that was leaking into the microphone. If I bypass the EQ, you can hear the low end from the tabla coming through, but I don't want to mess with phase issues between different microphones, so I keep the handpan signal free of low end from the tabla, and we only focus on what we really need from that microphone and leave the low end portion of the tabla and the other instruments for the respective microphones. Then again, we have some parallel particles, which is adding some snap in the higher mids and just bringing the handpan to life. As you can hear, when I bypass this parallel compression thing, the handpan almost disappears in the mix. You lose all that density and you only have some spikes that coming out, but I wanted this instrument to really sound huge and massive all the time. Controlled, but big, because it's the lead instrument here, and I really want it to be featured nicely, and parallel compression is a nice way of keeping somewhat the intact original dynamics, but adding in that nice compactness of compression in parallel and just beefing up the whole signal and making it much more solid than without compression at all. Next, a tiny little bit more corrective EQ. Removing a little bit of fundamental range and adding a touch of air. And finally, again, a limiter just to get some volume. In this case, it's not really catching any peaks. I really use it only as a gain plugin, basically. So here also, nothing really dramatic happened. So it was more about capturing every instrument right and just doing tiny moves to keep the instrument sounding very natural and pretty dynamic and play well in a well-balanced way together. But that's not all we did. We still have to have a look at the effects that I added, like the reverbs, what I chose to use and why. Then we have all the automation stuff that I did. I'm going to walk you through different parts and show you what kind of automation I used and why I did this. And then we have the Mixbus Processing that is also adding some general character to the recording. And I'm going to show you this at the end. So now let's have a look at the effects used. I only used 4 effect returns here. We used Shimmer by Valhalla, which is a very dreamy, lush reverb. Then we used my trusty old Bricasti M7 for more like a small room emulation. Then one of my favorite reverbs ever, the EMT 250 emulation, just for general purpose, nice reverb. And then I have a 4th reverb, also Valhalla again. I used Vintage Verb because some instruments needed more reverb. And instead of adding more of 250, I instead used another reverb just to get not more of one, but then add in a second texture. That way you can have more reverb without having too much of one taste of reverb. Normally, I really have like a dozen, 15, or even 20 effect returns in big sessions, and I mix a lot of tiny amounts of different reverbs at once because it's less obvious than a lot of one reverb if you use tiny doses of a lot of different reverbs. It makes a difference. But in this case, using only 4 reverbs was enough for my taste. Generally, I treated all the instruments more or less the same reverb-wise, a little bit of room, a little bit of EMT250, but only the handpan I added more reverb because I just wanted it to sound a little bit bigger than the other instruments. And in the context, you don't notice how much reverb it actually is, except if I hit stop, then you can hear the big reverb tail. Listen to this. It's quite long, but it's melting in nicely. And now if we listen what it sounds like when I cut all the effects, then you can hear what the effects really do atmosphere-wise. So you can hear while it still sounds nice, but it sounds a little bit smaller, and we wanted it to sound big and open and a little bit dreamy, and reverb helps with this dreamy atmosphere. Now let's have a look at some automation details I made to help some sections of the song. A first example would be there is one part where the percussion only plays a hi-hat, and it was bleeding a little bit too much into the bass, so I made an EQ automation removing some high end from the bass so that the hi-hat would not cut through too loudly. You could hear that with this high cut I could really effectively remove the hi-hat completely from the bass and keep that signal a little bit cleaner. Now here there is a little part where the tabla is almost alone and I wanted it to have a little bit more air, so I cranked the high end, but only on that part. As you could hear, that would bring out a little bit more the attack and the finger noise hitting the skins so that it was really shiny and a little bit more present in that part. Now there is another part where I automated the EQ on the tabla, not for the high end this time, but we got a little bit more space and I wanted to hear all the low notes that the tabla is playing. You can really pull out a ton of different sounds from these tabla drums, and I didn't want to lose any of the nuances in this special part. Look at this. So I gave the tabla an extra little boost in the low fundamental when the player was playing those low notes so that we could still hear them well. And sometimes I automate the EQ on one instrument to work on another instrument. That sounds weird, but here in this example I removed some high end out of the handpan microphone. The microphone of the handpan was picking up so much high end that the sitar was shifting more towards the center than I wanted. So I removed some high end so that the sitar could sit where it was supposed to sit. Look at this. If you were listening with headphones or on good speakers, you could probably hear that the sitar is moving around whether I engage or disengage this EQ. The final little thing to look at is the mix bus. My way of working is usually the top-down method, so before I even start tweaking one individual instrument, I have my Mixbus ready. And most of the time I have quite a bit of stuff going on the Mixbus just because it's polishing my whole mix right from the start, and I don't have to do as much on the individual tracks because the whole mix already shines a little bit more and I have a little bit of volume and compactness going instead of having to try and squeeze out everything from the individual microphones. So I walk you through what I have on the Mixbus in this particular session. First of all, I have an instance of Soothe that is just controlling the low end a little bit, because we have the low end of the Tabla, which can be pretty powerful, although you wouldn't think of it because it's pretty small in size, but it has a pretty solid low end. And then we have the upright bass, which is obviously having a lot of bass. And I didn't want the sum of those two to get a little bit overwhelming in the mix. So having an instance of Soothe calming down the low end a little bit is pretty nice. Next, something similar, and this is a plugin that is basically living on my Mixbus, is Gullforce, which is a kind of automatic, general, adapting EQ thing, which is calming down the whole signal. If you get a little excess of low end, it's taming slightly. If it's getting a little bit dull, it's boosting slightly in a very, very subtle way. No dramatic change if I bypass it, but it's the sum of all these. A little bit of Soothe, a little bit of Gullforce, a little bit of what's coming next. And they share the duties that have to be done on the Mixbus, like calming down the whole signal, compacting it ever so slightly. And if you have a lot of different tools working on the same basic tasks, it's less obvious for the ear than if you have, like, let's say, one compressor doing all the heavy lifting. Next plugin I used is one that I usually use at the very end of the chain, but in this case I only used 50% of the amount of work that it's doing just to embellish the whole mix a little bit. It's kind of multi-band processing going on. It's doing a nice job and it's just clearing up the whole mix and making it a little bit more compact. Then the next is a very subtle EQ, just getting rid of a little excess low end, and finally a limiter to get to final loudness in a safe way. And that's about it. No really big moves on any of the instruments. I really tried to capture everything as cleanly as possible with a lot of headroom, which is very important. And then just do some cosmetic stuff more than any real repair things. The musicians were fantastic. Everyone was really a master at his craft, so it was a breeze to record. And yeah, that makes mixing much easier. This would be like one of the biggest mixing tricks, is record well so the mixing gets much easier. I hope you enjoyed this little walk through this session. Thank you for watching. And if you like this kind of videos, make sure to stay subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos. See you next time. Bye bye. Take care.